Hey everyone, long-time lurker, first-time poster. I never thought I'd be sharing something like this, but after what I experienced, I felt like I had to. A little background: I'm the CEO of a mid-sized logistics company. We handle last-mile delivery for major retailers, which means we're the people making sure your packages get to your doorstep. On paper, things looked fine. Our numbers were solid, customer satisfaction was decent, and our operations team assured me everything was running smoothly. But I kept hearing murmurs. Drivers quitting suddenly, complaints about long hours, and oddly enough, reports that some deliveries were taking much longer than they should. I didn't want to be the kind of CEO who sits in a boardroom making decisions without knowing what's really happening on the ground. So, I decided to go undercover. I grew out some stubble, traded my usual blazer for a beat-up hoodie, and signed up as a contract driver under a fake name, Mike. Our company uses a third-party hiring system for seasonal workers, so I was able to slip through the cracks without anyone recognizing me. I'd be spending a week delivering packages, just like any other driver. On my first day, I arrived at the warehouse at 5 a.m., coffee in hand, ready to prove to myself that I could handle the job I expected my employees to do. That's when I met my first wake-up call, Kevin, a driver in his late 50s with a limp and a permanent frown. He looked me up and down and smirked. "First day, huh? Hope you like lifting boxes, new guy." I laughed it off, but within the first hour, I realized he wasn't joking. Each driver had to load their own van, and the packages were everywhere. Some were labeled incorrectly, some were half-crushed, and others were buried under mountains of other deliveries. The warehouse was chaotic, with people shouting destinations over the noise of beeping scanners. The whole process was a mess. By the time I finally got my van loaded, I was already sweating. Kevin, on the other hand, was finishing up his third cup of coffee, shaking his head at me. "Gonna be a long day, Mike," he chuckled. I had no idea just how right he was. So, after struggling to load my van, I finally hit the road for my first real day as a delivery driver. I had 85 stops to make. That sounded doable? I mean, I had driven routes before, I knew the city, and my GPS was working fine. How bad could it be? Well, the first thing I learned? The GPS is not always your friend. The app we used to route deliveries was supposed to optimize my stops, but it kept directing me to roads that were closed or sending me on weird looping detours. At one point, I was literally on a highway with no exits for miles, only to realize I had passed my delivery point 5 minutes ago. Then there were the apartment buildings. I had a package for Unit 4B in a building that for some reason only labeled every other floor. There was no working elevator. So I climbed 6 flights of stairs, only to realize 4B didn't exist, just 4A and 4C. I tried calling the customer, no answer. I knocked on random doors hoping someone would have a clue. Finally, an elderly man opened his door, took one look at me, and said, "Oh yeah, that happens a lot. 4B is actually labeled as 5B for some reason." Great. Back down, up another flight. But the worst part? The time pressure. Every stop took longer than expected, either because I couldn't find the right address, or because I had to wait for someone to come get their package. But the system? It didn't care. The app was still counting down the time I was supposed to be at each location, and I quickly fell behind. By lunchtime, I was nearly an hour off schedule. At one stop, a woman answered the door holding a screaming baby. She was juggling a phone call and trying to grab the package at the same time. I smiled and told her to take her time. A small moment of kindness, right? Well, the app flagged my stop as taking too long, and my estimated finish time jumped even later. I started to understand why so many drivers were quitting. Kevin was right, it was a long day. By the time I finished my last delivery, the sun was setting. I was exhausted, starving, and my back was killing me. I pulled into the warehouse, expecting to return my van and head home. But when I walked in, I saw Kevin sitting on a crate, shaking his head. "You ran late, huh?" he asked, not even looking up from his coffee. I let out a tired laugh. Yeah, GPS was a nightmare, apartments are a mess, and the app kept penalizing me for taking too long. Kevin finally met my eyes, this time with something that looked like sympathy. "Welcome to the job, Mike." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him I was the CEO and that I was going to fix all of this. But I didn't. Instead, I just sat down beside him, rubbing my sore legs. Because for the first time, I realized I had no idea how hard this job really was. After my first brutal day, I told myself that things would get easier. Maybe I just needed to find my rhythm, get used to the pace. But the next morning, as I dragged my sore body out of bed at 4:30 a.m., I wasn't so sure. When I walked into the warehouse, Kevin was already there, sipping coffee like he hadn't just worked a grueling shift yesterday. He glanced at me, smirking. "No quitting yet?" I forced a laugh. "Not today." He patted me on the back, a little too hard. "Good. You'll get used to it. Or you won't." I should have paid more attention to that second part. The warehouse was already chaotic. Packages were everywhere, some missing labels, some crushed, others leaking something I decided I didn't want to ask about. A few drivers were arguing with the shift supervisor about last-minute changes to their routes, their frustration palpable. One guy, Raul, slammed his scanner down and yelled, "They keep adding stops. How the hell am I supposed to deliver 110 packages in one shift?" The supervisor, Jerry, barely looked up from his clipboard and muttered, "Just move faster." Raul muttered something under his breath and stormed off. I watched the whole thing unfold, feeling something uncomfortable settle in my chest. I'd read reports about driver dissatisfaction, high turnover, and long hours. I knew the statistics. But numbers on a spreadsheet were different from standing in a room full of exhausted people who were just trying to do their jobs. By the time I finished loading my van, faster than yesterday, but still embarrassingly slow compared to the seasoned drivers, I was already tired. But I didn't have time to think about it. The clock was ticking, the app was already counting down my estimated delivery times, and I was falling behind before I even hit the road. I tried to work faster, but the job seemed designed to make that impossible. The routing system was a joke, sending me across town and back instead of in any logical order. Apartment buildings were a nightmare, some without working elevators, others requiring entry codes I didn't have. When customers didn't answer the door, I had to mark the package as undeliverable, which meant I'd have to come back later, doubling my workload. And the app? The app didn't care. It just flagged me as falling behind, as if I wasn't already sweating through my shirt trying to keep up. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted, frustrated, and questioning every decision I had ever made that led me to this moment. That's when I saw him, an older driver, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, struggling to carry a massive package up a set of stairs. He was moving slow, his legs shaking slightly, his face red from exertion. At the top of the stairs stood a man in a suit, arms crossed, watching him struggle. I hesitated for a second, then jogged over. "Hey man, you okay?" The older driver, his name tag said Ron, forced a weak smile. "Yeah, just give me a second." He tried lifting the package again, but nearly lost his grip. The guy in the suit sighed. "Come on, I don't have all day." I didn't even think. I grabbed the other end of the box and helped Ron carry it up the steps. He gave me a surprised look. "You don't have to." "It's fine," I said. "Let's just get this done." We set the package down, and the suit guy barely muttered a thanks before shutting the door. Ron sat down on the stairs, wiping sweat from his forehead, his breathing heavy. "You all right?" I asked. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Been doing this job 15 years. Never gets easier." I sat next to him, stretching out my sore legs. "You ever think about quitting?" He let out a dry laugh. "Every damn day." I didn't know what to say to that, so I stayed quiet. After a moment, he added, "But I got grandkids. I need the health insurance." That hit me harder than I expected. I had known our workforce was aging. I'd seen it in the reports. But seeing Ron exhausted, forcing himself to keep going because he had to, not because he wanted to, made my stomach twist. After a few minutes, Ron checked his watch, sighed, and forced himself to his feet. "Welp, better keep moving before the app starts yelling at me." I watched him go, something in my chest tightening. Something was seriously wrong. By the time I finally finished my route, it was well past sunset. I was dragging myself back into the warehouse, dead on my feet, when I saw Raul arguing with Jerry again. "Why are you so late?" Jerry demanded. Raul ripped off his ID badge and threw it onto the desk. "Because you keep overloading us. I had 120 stops today. You think that's reasonable?" Jerry sighed. Look, if you can't keep up. No, Raoul cut him off. I can't keep up. No one can. That's why people keep quitting. I'm done, man. Screw this job. With that, he grabbed his things and walked out. No one tried to stop him. I just stood there, watching Raoul disappear into the night, my heart pounding. Kevin sighed beside me. That's the third one this week. I exhaled slowly, my hands clenching into fists. I had come here expecting to find a few inefficiencies, some operational hiccups we could fix. But this wasn't about inefficiencies. This was about people. And as the CEO of this company, I had let it get this bad. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Raoul storming out of the warehouse, Ron struggling up those stairs, and Kevin's exhausted face as he muttered, "You'll get used to it. Or you won't." I had spent years running this company from a distance, trusting that my managers were keeping things in order. But now that I had seen it for myself, I couldn't unsee it. The next morning, I arrived at the warehouse early, still dressed as Mike, the new guy. I wasn't ready to reveal myself just yet. I needed to see how things played out when the CEO wasn't watching. When I walked in, I saw Jerry standing near the loading docks, barking orders at the warehouse staff. Move faster. We're already behind. His tone was sharp, dismissive, like he was talking to machines, not people. Muttering spread through the room, but no one argued. They were too tired, too resigned. Then I heard a familiar voice, Ron. Jerry, I got assigned a route with 130 stops today. I can't do that many. My knee's acting up. Jerry didn't even look at him. Not my problem, Ron. You take the route, or you don't get paid. I felt something in me snap. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. Hey man, 130 stops? That's insane. Jerry turned, annoyed. And you are? I straightened. Mike. I pointed at Ron. He's been here for 15 years. Shouldn't he be assigned fewer stops? Jerry scoffed. If he can't keep up, he should retire. The words hit me like a slap. I looked at Ron, whose face was unreadable, but his hands clenched into fists. I took a slow breath. That's how you see it? If someone can't physically destroy themselves for this job, they don't deserve it. Jerry's eyes narrowed. Look, new guy, I don't have time for a lecture. The job is the job. If you can't handle it either, you know where the door is. I stared at him for a long moment. Then I pulled my employee badge out of my pocket, the one with my real name on it, and tossed it on the table in front of him. Actually, I said, my voice steady, I own the door. Silence. Jerry blinked. His eyes darted to the badge, then back up at me. Wait, what? I crossed my arms. I'm Jacob Reed, CEO of this company. And I've spent the last 3 days working this job. So now I have plenty of time for a lecture. The warehouse went dead silent. Drivers, warehouse staff, even the guys in the back unloading trucks had stopped to stare. Jerry's face went pale. I took a step forward. I came here because I wanted to see what my employees go through. And you know what I found? A broken system. A culture where overworking people is normal. Where drivers are treated like robots. Where people like Ron, who have given 15 years to this company, are told to suck it up or leave. Jerry swallowed hard. Sir, I cut him off. You're fired. The words came out sharper than I expected, but I didn't take them back. Jerry opened his mouth, then shut it again. He knew better than to argue. He yanked off his own badge, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Kevin let out a low whistle. Well, damn. I turned to Ron. How many stops can you actually do in a day without wrecking your body? He hesitated. 80, maybe 90. Then from now on, that's your max. I turned to the room. That goes for everyone. No more of this keep up or get out nonsense. From now on, we work smarter. Not just harder. The tension in the warehouse started to shift. People exchanged cautious glances, as if they weren't sure whether to believe me. I didn't blame them. After all, words are easy. Change is harder. And I had a hell of a lot of work to do. Firing Jerry was the easy part. The hard part was proving to my employees that I meant what I said. They'd heard promises before. They'd had managers come and go, each one swearing they'd make things better, only for nothing to change. I could see it in their faces. Even after I laid down new rules, there was skepticism, hesitation. But I wasn't leaving until I made this right. I spent the rest of the morning talking to drivers one-on-one. I wanted to understand their struggles, not just as numbers on a spreadsheet, but as real problems. Ron admitted he'd been popping painkillers to get through his shifts. Kevin told me he had to rush bathroom breaks because stopping too long messed up his route time. Another driver, Maria, confessed that she'd been skipping lunches just to finish her stops on time. She was a single mom, and if she clocked out too late, she couldn't pick up her kid from daycare. Every single person I spoke to had a story like this. It was infuriating. Not at them, but at myself. How had I let my own company become this? That afternoon, I gathered everyone in the warehouse. This time, I wasn't talking to them as Mike, the clueless new guy. I was their CEO, and I was ready to listen. "We're making changes," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Starting today." The room was quiet. I could see people folding their arms, waiting to see if I was just another executive making empty promises. First, routes will be capped. No more of these insane 120 stop days. We'll be analyzing real data, not just what the app says, to make sure each route is actually doable. If you run into a problem, you call it in. No penalties. I saw Kevin's eyebrows raise slightly, like he wanted to believe me but wasn't ready to. Second, lunch breaks. Actual lunch breaks. Not eat while you're driving breaks. Not grab a snack between stops breaks. Everyone gets 30 minutes off the clock, no exceptions. If we have to hire more drivers to make that happen, we'll do it. Maria's head snapped up at that one. Third, support. I saw firsthand how the routing system sucks. We're working on fixing it, and until we do, dispatch is going to have a dedicated team to help reroute drivers when things don't make sense. No more wasting time on bad directions. I took a breath, then added, and if you ever feel like you're drowning in this job, I want to hear about it. Not when you're already at the breaking point. Before that. Silence. I had laid it all out there. Now, I had to wait and see how they reacted. It was Ron who finally spoke up. "We've heard stuff like this before." His voice was calm but firm. "We've had managers say they'd fix things, and nothing changed." I met his gaze. "I get that. And I don't blame you for doubting me." Ron studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's see if you mean it." That was the moment everything shifted. It wasn't applause or cheers. It wasn't a sudden outpouring of trust. It was acceptance, a quiet agreement to give me a chance. And that was enough. But talk is talk. I needed action. I stayed at the warehouse for the rest of the week, making sure every change I promised actually happened. The next day, when Maria took a real lunch break for the first time in months, I sat with her in the break room just to make sure no one interrupted. When Kevin called dispatch about a routing issue, I made sure someone actually answered and helped him fix it. When Ron finished his shift with 85 stops instead of 130, I saw the difference in his face. He looked tired, but not wrecked. And when the next driver quit, it wasn't out of frustration. It was because he got a better opportunity somewhere else. That I could live with. The real test came a few weeks later. One morning, I got a call from my assistant at corporate. "Sir, I just got an email from a regional manager," she said. "They're asking why delivery times are slightly slower than last quarter." I smiled. "Tell them to check the employee retention numbers instead." Because for the first time in a long time, drivers weren't quitting in droves. They were staying. And that told me everything I needed to know. The changes I put in place were working. I could see it. Drivers weren't quitting at the same rate. People weren't coming and looking like they hadn't slept in days. Maria was actually sitting down for lunch instead of scarfing a sandwich in the van between stops. Ron's knee wasn't completely wrecked by the end of his shift. But the real test wasn't whether we could fix things in the short term. The real test was whether these changes would last. A month after I went undercover, I came back to the warehouse, this time as myself. No disguise, no fake name. I wanted to see what had stuck. When I walked in, Kevin raised an eyebrow. "So you're not Mike anymore, huh?" I grinned. "Nope." He sipped his coffee and nodded. "Gotta say, things are better. But we'll see if it stays that way." That was fair. I'd earned some trust, but not all of it. Not yet. I spent the morning checking in with the warehouse crew, then went on a ride-along with one of our newer drivers, Malik. He was young, early 20s, fresh out of school, and still learning the ropes. As we drove, he told me he'd heard about the Undercover CEO thing from the other drivers. "So, is it true?" he asked. "You actually did the job?" "Yeah," I said. "And I was terrible at it." He laughed. "Well, at least you tried." Then, after a pause, he added, "Most guys up top wouldn't." That stuck with me. It wasn't about whether or not I had been good at the job. It was the fact that I did it, that I had seen their world and actually cared enough to make things better. As we pulled up to an apartment complex for a delivery, Malik hesitated. "What's up?" I asked. He sighed. "Customer notes say leave at door, but last time I was here, the package got stolen, and the guy called screaming at dispatch." I frowned. "What's the policy?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Technically, if the customer requests it, we leave it. But I dunno, man. I don't want to get someone's stuff stolen again." I thought about it. About how the company had so many rigid rules, but none of them accounted for common sense. "You think it's safer to knock?" I asked. "Yeah. Then knock." He looked at me, like he was waiting for me to tell him he'd get written up for it. When I didn't, he grinned and hopped out of the van. It was such a small moment, but it reminded me how much these drivers were constantly forced to choose between following company policy and doing what actually made sense. That had to change too. Over the next few months, the company continued making changes. We reworked our routing system, making sure it actually optimized deliveries instead of just throwing stops onto drivers without thinking. We adjusted pay structures so drivers weren't penalized for things outside their control. We started hiring more people so workloads were actually manageable. But the biggest change? We started listening. We held monthly meetings where drivers could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. We had an anonymous suggestion box that I actually read. And instead of managers making decisions in a vacuum, we started bringing drivers into those conversations. And it worked. 6 months after I went undercover, employee turnover had dropped by nearly 40%. Customer complaints were down. Deliveries were actually on time, not because we were forcing people to work faster, but because we had smarter systems in place. But more than that, the energy of the company had changed. People weren't dragging themselves into work, counting the minutes until they could leave. There was still stress. This was still logistics, after all, but it wasn't the kind of crushing, soul-sucking stress that had driven people like Raul to walk out mid-shift. Speaking of Raul, he reached out a few weeks ago. He had taken a job at another company, but he'd heard about the changes and wanted to let me know he respected what I had done. "I would have stayed if things had been like this before," he admitted. That hit hard. Because he was right. I should have fixed this sooner. I should have known. But I didn't. Because for years, I had been looking at numbers, not people. That was my biggest lesson in all of this. It's easy, as a CEO, to think you know how your company runs. To trust that the systems you've built are working. But numbers don't tell you about the driver who skips lunch to hit his targets. They don't tell you about the woman who has to sprint up 6 flights of stairs with a 50-pound box because the elevator's broken. They don't tell you about the guy who keeps showing up with a bad knee because he can't afford not to. I had to see it to understand it. And now that I had, I wasn't going back. So, if you ever wonder if the higher-ups in your company really know what's going on, chances are, they don't. But they should. And if they don't care enough to find out, then they don't deserve to be running the company at all.